So hello everybody, welcome to lesson or session 3. I hope you're all doing well this afternoon and had a good weekend. Over the past couple of lessons, we learned about honeybee biology, about the beekeeper's tools and the hive and its components. In the last lesson, we learned about how to get your bees, where to find bees, and how to install the bees into your hives. And in this particular lesson, I'm assuming now that you've gone ahead, you've purchased your equipment, you've got your bees on order, and it's sometime in June. You've received your nukes and you've installed them, and now you sit back and you say, "I'm a beekeeper, but what do I do now?" What does a beekeeper do during the course of the year? This is what we'll be covering today, mostly. So let's get right at it. It's a pretty heavy lesson. This is the meat of all the beekeeping training that you need to know about. Like this. There. So, as a beekeeper, you'll be visiting your hives on a regular basis. We recommend that you visit them no less than once a week. Ideally, every 5 days or so, 4 or 5 days. That's pretty good. But once a week is ideal. Is the minimum. If you needed to let it slide for 10 days or 2 weeks, well, in the summer, we can let that pass. But you might have some unpleasant surprises when you come back after a 2-week absence. Of course, you don't have to visit your hives in the winter. I'm talking about the peak season. Once you're out of the spring, out of the winter, into May. Once you're into May, late April, May, you should be visiting them fairly regularly. So what do you do? What do you do when you're visiting your hives? First of all, a beekeeper has to be a bit of a sleuth, a bit of a what do you call that? A detective. You have to look for clues, and there's a lot of clues that you can get simply by looking at your bees from the outside to see how they're doing. You on arrival at your hives, you'll look at them and see what you could learn just by looking at them. And based on that, you might want to then inspect inside. So in this lesson, we're going to look at how to inspect outside, what to look for, and then we'll look at what to look for inside once you decide to have a look deeper in your hive. Okay. Whoops. What have I done? What have I done? Oh my God, I've jumped to the very end of my presentation. I don't know. Let's go. So you'll be looking for clues that will let you know if your hive is weak or strong, if it's healthy or diseased, if it's under any kind of stress, if it's preparing to swarm. Based on your observations, you will determine what follow-up actions are required. So what do we look for when we're looking for these kinds of these indications? Well, first, on arrival on your hives, at your bee yard, you want to make sure your hives are in good condition. You want to make sure that the entrances are not covered by growing grass. That will stress the bees out, it will frustrate them, and will not be good for honey production. You want to make sure your woodenware is in good shape. And there's that same old beehive we saw a couple of lessons ago. I like that one. It's really a museum piece. It's like maybe a Roman beehive that survived the past 2,000 years. That's not possible because they didn't have these kinds of beehives, but it certainly looks like it's been there for a long time. So if your beehive is looking like the one on the left, time to replace it. Time to throw all that away and get started with a new one. And if it's looking like those on the right, it's time to cut the grass. You want to see if your hives are being bothered by varmint, like raccoons or skunks. I've had my hives for many years in a pretty rural area here, and there are certainly lots of raccoons and skunks around, but I've never had any problems with them. In the picture you see here, you see evidence of a raccoon here scratching at the entrance, enticing the bees out and then eating the bees. I don't know how regular this might be because I imagine that the skunks and raccoons are getting stung, but perhaps it's worth the tasty meal that they would get out of doing this. So if you do see this kind of activity, you might want to erect a fence or some kind of obstacle to keep them from scratching at the hive entrance. Notice in this hive on the right, the beekeeper has put an entrance reducer down below. So the main entrance here has been reduced to a very small area right here. You will also want to have an idea of how busy your hive is, because a busy hive is an excellent sign. You've got a high population, they're working hard to bring in pollen and their nectar. So that's a good sign. What does a busy hive look like? Well, there are a lot of bees at the entrance. They're flying in and out. It looks like an international airport. There's nothing quite like watching from about 10 meters away with the sun behind your back. You're looking at your hives, and let's say the hives are against a dark forest, for instance, and you'll see the sun shining on every bee that flies in and out of the hives. It really looks like a very, very busy international airport with all kinds of arrivals and departures nonstop. It's a pleasant sight. But so if on a sunny, warm day your hive is not busy, you think, wow, there's what's going on? It could be a sign that you have a low population. And that's okay. Early in the season, in May, beginning of June, shouldn't be that big deal. But by the time the middle of June comes along, you should be seeing busy hives, quite busy hives. It could be that your hive is sick. There's disease in there. That could be an issue. It could mean that your queen is weak, is not a good queen. She's getting old, or she's not laying new eggs. No bees are not emerging, and your population's dwindling. Or maybe your hive has swarmed between the last time you checked and now. If you checked, let's say on a Monday, and you saw that it was a nice sunny day and your hives were busy, lots of activity, and you come back on a Friday and there's nothing happening, it's still a nice day, chances are you got a swarm. You'll want to see if pollen is coming in. So in this picture here, if you look closely, this particular bee has pollen in its pollen baskets. And it's a very common sight during the year. The pollen, as we said, is the source of protein in the feeding of the bees. It's the only place they get their protein, and so they bring a lot of pollen in. Pollen collection is something a beekeeper can do. You can put in a special trap at the entrance. You put it there, and it pushes the pollen off their hind legs down below into a little box, and you collect all the pollen that the bees are bringing in. You could do that. You can't take it always all the time, but from time to time, you can put your pollen trap and collect quite a bit of pollen this way. And it's very nice. You'll notice by looking at your pollen that it comes in so many different colors. I've got my famous picture of a bee inside a geranium, a red geranium, and the pollen is crimson red. And here we have yellow pollen. You can have beige, green, purple pollen. It comes in all colors. So it's nice to see the pollen coming in. It should be coming in on a nice day when there are flowers out. If you see that, no action is required. You'll also notice from time to time some peculiar behaviors that don't seem to make sense to you. So fanning is one of them. Many bees, you'll see many bees at the entrance. They're facing inwards and they're beating their wings vigorously. I would call that fanning. And it's a very normal and a very common behavior. Fanning, bees will be fanning almost always, particularly on a warmer sunny day. It's about hive temperature control and humidity control. They may be wanting to get a current of air going through the hive to remove the humidity from the honey, or it may on a hot day, they may be just trying to cool things down a bit. So here I have a little video of fanning in action here. It's a 2-minute video, but I'll just play 30 seconds of it so you get an idea what it looks like. Whoops, I missed my video. There you go. So they're just there, beating their wings, doing their thing. While some other bees are working, bringing in pollen and nectar. You'll notice this hive is all wood. It hasn't been painted. I would say the vast majority of beekeepers paint their hives. It's the easiest thing to do. You use an exterior paint so that it will help the wood weather the conditions much better. Your hives will last many years that way. And there's some beekeepers will dip their woodenware in wax, melted wax. So this one here looks like that's what they did. It's got to be a certain mixture of wax. It can't be any kind of wax for a variety of reasons. And the beekeepers are perfecting that practice. It's more expensive, of course, than just painting them, but it's another practice. Someone asked me recently, can I just stain my hives and maybe lacquer them as well instead of painting them? And seems to me that should be all right. You only do that on the outside, of course. And as long as the stain and the lacquer is very dry before you actually put bees in there, you want to do this at least a month in advance and perhaps leave them out outside for a month just to get all those chemical scents out of there before you put them in. I think it should be okay. But you know, whatever you do, it's designed to help the wood resist over time. Whoops. So there's another peculiar behavior called washboarding. This is when you have a lot of bees on the front of the hive and they seem to be scratching or rubbing the surface of the hive in unison. It's quite a sight to see, a very peculiar behavior. I've only seen it once in my life in my hives, but it's quite obvious when they're doing it. And I did some research in preparing this class. You know, I know people have all kinds of theories why they do this, and I did some research, went online and looked at, you know, credible sources. These are beekeeping experts and even scientific sources. And frankly, from what I can gather, nobody really knows why they do this. And one question I would like to ask an expert is if these bees do this on wild colonies as well. Do they go out in the tree trunk and do the same thing? So it's a normal behavior, but it's a mystery. If you see them do that, there's nothing to worry about. Just let them do their own thing. So I have another little short video to show you what it looks like. Oops, here you go. Well, just a couple seconds, eh?
Hey, Mark?
Yeah?
Is it okay to paint the inside of the hive?
No, you don't want to do that.
No?
Do that. Leave that bare wood. The bees will cover it with a fine layer of propolis. They're going to do their thing there. So don't start introducing chemicals or, you know, that kind of thing inside the hive.
On that side. Okay, thanks.
All right, so let's move on from this video. There's the washboarding. This is a lot of bees in this hive, a lot of bees. Looks good. So another peculiar behavior you'll certainly notice from time to time is bearding. It's often a sign of overcrowding or overheating. All the bees, they seem to be coming out of the hive and just hanging out on the surface. So they're not, you know, they're not washboarding. They're just standing there and just, you know, biding the time. If you see this kind of behavior, if you're assuming it's overheating, you might want to add supers to give them more, or overcrowding. You might want to add supers to give them more space inside. Or you might also, it could be a sign of overheating. You might want to lift the outer cover a little bit so that there's a bit of air circulation going on in the hive. Or even you can displace the actual boxes, the brood boxes, and leaving like a ½ centimeter gap in the front or in the back so more air flows, and that could be helpful on very hot days. If you think they're crowded in there, you might want to add a slatted rack. We mentioned this. Did we mention this before, the slatted rack?
Nope.
Okay. This is a piece of equipment that I started using it. I think I like it. I do like it, and I don't think I like it. And every one of my hives has one now. Slatted rack is about 5 centimeters tall. And if you put it between the bottom board and the first brood box, right? Just slide it here, and it raises the brood box by 5 centimeters. It introduces a lot of dead air space here. So there's more volume of space inside the hive, but this volume is not occupied by frames with comb. It's just dead air space. So that, some people say it gives you more space inside the hive, because it could be crowded in there, but what if it's raining, right? So where do these bees go? They need a space to go. This is also, I think, a very useful piece of equipment in the winter, because it'll insulate the cluster of bees in the winter from cold air, which would accumulate at the bottom to a certain extent. This is my theory. They do exist. They have been in use for a long time. You don't absolutely need that. This is a great example of the kind of extra things you might want to buy after you get into beekeeping. Some of you have asked me, I want to buy the equipment, what I see in the store, the beginner's kit is all I need. And I answer, yes, it's all you need. But like in any hobby, there's always, oh, I just want to have one of those. Oh, this would be so good to have one of these. And you end up spending more money. They're not necessary. They're not critical, but it's always a little extra that you might consider buying if you want to. If you're very handy in a woodworking shop, a lot of people make their own. Whoops. Bearding can also mean a sign of imminent swarming. So before they start, all the bees take off, they start leaving the hive and they gather at the entrance and they're flying around, especially if they're flying around as well or close to the entrance. You might think, oh, this could probably be a swarm. And if you're already there, that means it's too late to do anything about that swarm. That's the old queen is about to leave that hive. She'll be leaving in a matter of less than an hour probably, or certainly that day. Other peculiar behaviors is robbing. You might see bees, they're attacking each other at the front of your hive. They're biting each other's wings. They seem to be wrestling, and it's unusual to see that. And that's typically the behavior associated with robbing. Bees are coming into one hive, and it could be a weak hive, and they're trying to steal the honey. And the weak hive is trying to defend their hive, and they're fighting. So if your hive is weak like that, you might lose that colony. It might lose all of its honey. It'll never be able to pass the winter. So depending on the time of year, if this is happening, let's say in June, you think, well, in June, there's time for this hive to regain strength and have good chances of surviving the winter. So you'll take some action to protect that hive from robbing and make sure that this population grows over the end of June, July, and August, so that it has good chances of surviving the winter. But if they're weak like this, in September, the early September, you won't have a chance to strengthen that hive before the winter sets in. And you might take other actions, such as combining it with another hive so that the bees can go and strengthen another hive. You can combine two weaker hives to make one hive that has a greater chance of spending the winter. So if you do see some robbing, you can reduce the entrance so that it's easier for the attacked hive to protect their resources. You could also take frames. If you have more than one hive, you take frames from another hive that are full of capped brood or larvae, and you put it in your weak hive. So that weak hive will then have a whole new strong generation of new bees coming up shortly to help them defend their hive and to gather honey and nectar and then boost the population. As I said, if it's the worst case scenario, you combine it with another hive. You might see this, you will probably see this at the front of your entrance, the entrance of your hive. It's typical. And what we have here, if you look closely, this is an entrance, but it's not the regular entrance at the bottom of the hive. This is an upper entrance at the top of the hive. So the bees are flying in and out of the top entrance. This is typical of late winter. In the late winter, the bees tend to use the top entrance quite a bit because over the winter, the bottom entrance has been blocked. It might be full of dead bees down there, and they're using the top entrance. And of course, as soon as the warm weather kicks in, I'm talking 5, 6, 7 degrees, even colder than that, but those bees who go out any colder than that will probably die. But as soon as it gets a bit warmer, the bees will go out and have an evacuation flight. They're going to evacuate their bowels that they've been holding in for a long, long time. And this basically is bee poop along the front of the hive. It could be a sign of nosema, dysentery, or diarrhea, if you like it. It's caused by, some foreign agent, a bacteria, I believe. But usually it's normal, and after winter is over, they'll get over it. Once the conditions improve, they get over it. There's not much that needs to be done. If you see this in the middle of the summer, though, that's another story. Then you'd have to look at treating dysentery if possible, or improve the conditions, the internal hygiene of the hive so that they can get over it by themselves. Usually they get over it by themselves. If you see little bees with their wings like that, the wings are all deformed. That's called they're suffering from a virus. It's called the deformed wing virus. And that they're born like that, and it basically, they have a short life. They become pretty useless little bees. And typically this is associated with an out of control varroa mite infestation. The varroa mite, we'll talk about it shortly, is one of the biggest not challenges, but management challenges for beekeepers these days. If you know how to handle it, it's pretty easy to handle it. Once you just get the hang of doing what you have to do, you shouldn't have a problem, but you do have to stay on top of the varroa mite in order to keep your hives healthy. We'll talk about that shortly. But if you do see a bee like that, it's not a good sign. In most cases, it might be even too late to say the colony, the varroa infestation is just too strong if it's come to that. There are ways, I've looked it up, on how to treat a colony that has been affected to the point where it has a deformed wing virus. It's a lot of work. I don't know what the chances of success are. I didn't get the impression they were that great. And I have, personally, reviewing all that, my conclusion was just forget about it. This is a dead hive. Not even bother trying to save it. Of course, it always depends on the time of year. If it's happening in June, as opposed to September. When things like this happen in June, you have a lot more leeway to do something. By the time September comes along, the season's over. I mean, this hive, it's weak, it's sick, it's not going to be in a top shape to go into the winter. A hive has to be like an Olympic athlete the day before the race. They have to be at the top of their form before going into the winter. You know, if they're not at the top of their form before going into the winter, the chances of not surviving the winter increase a lot. So you might see a lot of dead hives at the entrance, a lot of dead bees at the entrance of your hive. This is often a sign of pesticide poisoning. So somebody is applying some pesticides at the wrong time under the wrong conditions, and your bees are being exposed to it. If that's the case, well, try to get an idea. It depends on your community, your neighborhood. You'll have to call, you have to play it by ear, call a bee inspector and say, listen, I think something's happening here. And the bee inspector could have a look. I like to defend the farmers a little bit, you know. I mean, they're raising crops. It's a lot of work, and they have to deal with a lot of hard challenges as well. Like the bees have varroa mites, the farmers have their issues, and all kinds of chemicals and pesticides have been developed to help them. They're not always good ones. They have bad impacts on the environment in some cases, but in most cases, a lot of these products, if applied exactly as prescribed, they really reduce the incidence of any harmful effects. And that's the big challenge. So the farmers have to be attentive to the instructions on the application of the products to make sure that these kinds of things don't happen. For instance, you don't apply your product if it's by spray and it's a windy day, right? You don't apply a product when the plant is flowering, when all the bees and other insects will be in there. So these are the kind of instructions that are supposed to be followed when applying such products. It's a big question. It's not a black and white kind of issue, but in terms of beekeepers, that's the kind of issue you have to keep in mind. Okay, so we've gone through, any questions on that? We're finished with the external monitoring part. Any questions on that? Everything's good?
I'm good.
All right, let's go. Now that we've visited our hives, we've walked around them, we had a look, see what's going on. You might decide, listen, this or that hive, I think it's worth having a look inside. By looking inside, what can you determine? You can see if the colony has enough food stores. That's particularly the case going into the winter or very early spring when your hives are just coming out of winter in April. That's when they're most at risk of dying of starvation because they're running out of food, the population is growing, and nature does not yet have nectar or pollen that they can go and find. And it might even still be a bit cool. So that's the time where they might die of starvation. But also going into winter, you want to make sure they have enough food, so you might want to have a look, see what's going on in there. You want to see if the colony is queen right. You want to check that there is a queen and she's laying. You want to see if the population is high or low. You'll have had a good indication of that by looking at the outside, but it's always nice to have just a quick glimpse inside to see how things are going. Because you'll get an idea. You may have a very strong population today, and you look inside and you'll see no eggs. You'll see no larvae. So that means that the population you have is going to be dwindling quickly and there's nothing that's going to be replacing it. So what's going on? You have to do something about that. You can see if there's any other diseases that are bothering your hives, and you can see if you're getting honey, how the things are going. Of course, also you can see if there's any signs of imminent swarming. So a lot of things you can see when you open up a hive. So first of all, you get there, you'll be, when it's a cold day, when it's weather like we've been having now, you don't want to open up your hives. There's no use opening up your hives. You're going to be disturbing them more than anything else. But by the end of March, let's say you have normally we have those unusually warm days, 10 degrees maybe. You might want to have a peek inside to see how they're doing. Check if there's any honey left. Check to see if they're still alive. You may have lost a hive, your colony during the winter. and then determine whether you need to feed them or not. You can't forget that since early autumn, since about the 15th or maybe the end of September after you finish feeding them, it has been surviving exclusively on stored honey. And it can consume up to ½ a kilo of honey every week. And then that consumption rate goes up in late winter as the queen starts laying eggs and they have to feed the new bees. So by March and April, there's a risk of starvation. And that's when you think, maybe I should feed sugar patties. And I generally do that. Is it necessary or not? I don't know. I just do it just to be sure that they have what it takes. And usually I feed them sugar patties and they eat them. They don't leave them uneaten. In this picture on the left, you see this is a cluster of bees that is dead. This is what often looks like when your bees don't survive the winter. They're all stuck together, and you look at them, there's mold growing on them in the middle. Eh? They're blue-green there. Yeah, so those are dead bees. So sugar patties is a feed for your bees in the late winter. They're very easy to make. Basically, you put icing sugar into a mixing bowl, you add water until it has the consistency of toothpaste. And you might add a bit of glycerine, food grade glycerine. You can get that pretty easily. You can order it online, or I think the pharmacy has it. But the pharmacy has it in very small containers. I bought some online. You get like ½ a liter, and it lasts you a long time. So the glycerine helps keep the sugar patty like toothpaste. If it's just sugar and water, it's going to dry up and become hard as a rock, and that's much less attractive for bees in terms of food. The sugar patties, they eat directly. They will not be storing it in the hive. This is something they eat. So just to know that. I just learned that this year. I thought maybe they stored it in the hive, but no, they just go ahead and eat it on as needed basis. So you make these, you spread them thinly between 2 sheets of wax paper. So they're like a big patty. It could be 20 centimeters wide. And then you make several cross hatches on the paper, like with a box cutter or a very sharp knife. And you place that side down on the top over the frames. Now this picture I have, it's not quite the same approach, right? They've got their sugar patties there and they're rectangular, and it looks like there's also some wax paper on either side. But something along those lines. This is not like you're written in the Bible or anything like this. Just make sure the patties don't fall apart into little pieces. They can access them in a single place, keep things neat. And by putting cross hatches on the paper, it allows the bees to access the sugar patty at different places, not just around the edges of your patty. And you put that in, and you come back a week later, you'll see it hasn't been touched. Well, they got enough stores already still in their hive, or maybe they'll have chewed it all up. And what they do is they spit out the wax paper down below. You'll see wax paper at the bottom entrance of your hive. They'll clean their hive and throw it out of the hive. How about pollen? Your bees will have stored pollen in the previous summer and going into the fall, but in the winter, they're not getting more pollen, and they're starting to feed their baby bee, the new bees, the larvae, in February, March, and April, and they may run out of stores. So you can give them, this is artificial pollen. I put a picture of Bee Pro. This is exactly what I'm using. I'm not saying it's the best out there. I just looked around and it seemed to be what other people were using. So I bought a big bucket like that as well. It's like a brown, it looks like the chocolate milk powder kind of thing, but it's made with various plants, material, proteins to make sure that there's all the necessary amino acids are there for the bees to raise their brood. You add sugar syrup, so you mix 1-to-1 sugar and water, so you have a nice sugar syrup, and you mix it with your Bee Pro until, again, it reaches the consistency of toothpaste or something along those lines. And once again, you squish it between 2 pieces of wax paper, and you can put some cross hatches on it. There's no cross hatches on this, or perhaps they'll be on the other side. But you see the bees have been munching on it along the edges, so they're accessing the pollen supplement. And again, this is something that they feed directly to the larvae. They won't be storing it. It's something else I learned this year. So it's not really useful to put that in the fall, because if you put it in the fall, it's going to encourage the bees to make more brood, to increase their population. In the fall, you want to let them start dwindling down. You don't want the queen to start laying tons of eggs in September and October because you're giving them all this pollen. They're going to have too big a population to survive the winter. They're going to eat through all their honey. In our part of the world, Ontario, Quebec, and I guess these kind of latitudes, even in the rest of Canada, some of the earliest pollen comes from willow, and I think it's a maple tree. I forget which maple it is, but they produce their flowers very early. At the end of April, beginning of May, they're flowering, and that's some of the first and the most accessible pollen for our bees. They may even be flowering before the dandelions, so it's good to see that. I have a tree nearby here where one end of April, beginning of May, my neighbor was saying, Mark, there's a big maple tree. It's full of bees. And it's funny because there are maple trees everywhere, but somehow they all went to this particular maple tree. So you'll want to check also for eggs, right? What does it mean if you have eggs in your hive? Well, there's the answer right here. It's right on your screen. The queen has been laying at least no longer ago than 3 days, right? She laid an egg at least 3 days ago, because after 3 days, the eggs hatch. So if you see eggs, it's a good sign. There's a queen been active recently. Here in this picture, if you count the number of cells, it's roughly 10 by 10. So there's 100 worker bees are being prepared here. And because it takes 3 days for them to emerge, you know that if you see a picture, if you see something like this in your hive, in about 3 weeks' time, you'll have 100 bees coming out. Now, if you have a full frame of eggs, that's like both sides, that could be 2,000 bees. So that's very good news when you see things like that. But what if there are no eggs? You open up your hive, it's the end of June, it's July, and there's no eggs, you can't find any. That's a very worrying sign. As a beekeeper, that's not good. It's the whole new generation of workers is missing. What does it mean? It could mean that the hive is preparing for a swarm, or it could mean that there recently was a swarm. In that case, if it has recently swarmed, there's nothing you can do. If it's preparing for a swarm, well, you may be able to do something. We'll have to have a look at that, and I'll talk about it shortly. It also means that there's a dead, sick or old queen. She's there, and they're not going to swarm, but she's not laying very many eggs, so you might want to replace the queen. Send her to the guillotine. You want to check for the relative quantity of eggs, larvae, and capped brood. So we saw the eggs, that's nice. If there's a lot of eggs, but absolutely no brood, it means it shows that, hey, there has been a break in the reproductive cycle. It means that probably that you have had a swarm, and then, you know, all the eggs and brood that the old queen had laid, they've all grown up and they've become adults. And this is a new queen now that just started laying again. So you've had a break in your population cycle. You're going to have a hive that will not be optimum in terms of numbers, and you won't have that much honey production. So have a look, see if you can find eggs, larvae, and capped brood. If you have lots of each one of those, it's really nice to see. It's a good sign. In this picture here, I make the comment that the comb is dark. This comb, when it's first created by the bees, the wax, it's very light. It could be yellow or even white, depending on where they're getting their product. But as it gets old, it gets dark. And as a beekeeper, you know, it's okay to have, this is pretty nice looking dark brood, but it's getting old. You know, I would probably replace this the next year and with fresh comb again. Something to keep in mind. So here you have cells with young larvae. They're being fed. They're swimming in their royal jelly, their feed there. They're very happy. Here's an egg in this particular cell. You see the egg down there? Perhaps another egg down over here. And here I counted approximately 200 cells. So you'll have 200 workers emerging in the next 13 to 17 days. Good thing. Your factory is going to be working hard. You'll also want to check, of course, for brood. This is an ideal scenario. When you pull out a frame like this, you should be very happy and proud of yourself. It's perhaps 60% covered in capped brood, 20% with pollen. See the pollen there? You got different shades of yellow and orange. And the remainder around the edges would be honey. And that's a typical pattern. You have the brood in the middle, surrounded by pollen, and then surrounded by honey, more or less of each. And here, over 2,000 bees will emerge over the next 11 days at the latest. Very good sign. Happy beekeeper. Any questions?
I'm good.
I thought I'd give you a bit of an idea of the fluctuating beekeeping population, bee population over the course of the year. I talked about, someone's raised their hand. Lisa.
I figured out how to raise my hand this week.
I keep from all I'm learning about this, I keep seeing about, when we just talked about it, feeding the hive. And we're doing this in my mind because we've taken too much honey from them. Is that fair to say? I mean, if we did nothing and took no honey, they would certainly have enough for the winter.
It's not quite. It's not quite accurate. You feed the
No?
hive. You feed the hive at different times of year. You feed them in the spring because they're running out of feed. I guess to a certain extent, you could say that. I mean, the thing is, as they go into the winter, with their brood boxes have to be full of honey. They have to. We'll talk about that later, but they should weigh a certain amount. They should weigh 2 brood boxes together should weigh about 35 kilos. That means there's lots of honey in there. And based on the calorific needs of the colony over the winter, there should be plenty to keep them going until the following spring. So in that sense, whatever extra is they don't need, because you could leave lots of honey on your hive. Come spring, there's still piles of honey in there. You've just left the honey all winter long in the hive. They didn't need it. So the whole dance of the beekeeper and the colony is to say, how much can I take out and how much can I leave? The beekeeper wants to take out as much as possible, but don't take so much that the bees starve. But by ensuring that the 2 brood boxes are full of honey, you should be good to go. There should be no problems that they starve. That's why, what happens is you maybe have your last harvest at the beginning of September, and the bees are still there. They're still eating. There's not much honey and nectar left in the fields. They're eating their stores. They're eating. And so they could be reducing the amount of stores that they'll have for the winter. So if you feed them in September, then instead of eating their stores, they'll be eating what you're feeding them, or they're even turning that into honey and making sure their hive is packed as much as possible, full of honey, so that by the time you stop feeding them, end of September, beginning of October, the bees will be starting the winter with as much possible stores in the hive. And in the spring, if you feed them just in case something will happen, you didn't feed them enough in the fall, and you'll just give them a little boost. Maybe the winter was particularly long. It's into May, and we've had a stretch of cold weather. They haven't been able to fly, and you just give them a boost at that point. Is that
yeah. So, but I'm just thinking of the cycle that's used. If we didn't harvest that late, so if we didn't harvest it and we left it with them, could we harvest it in the spring? Because the honey itself's not going to go bad. Like early summer harvest instead of.
You harvest what's above the brood boxes. We had we have 2 brood boxes with the queen excluder, and down below it's their realm. You don't take anything down there, and up above is yours, right? So by the time you remove the top boxes, whatever's left below, there's still a week or 2 or 3 of nectar and then pollen gathering. They're going to keep on bringing that in. But you're right. I mean, if we left another box, a 3rd box on top full of honey, well, they would have access to that as well. You'd have to take the queen excluder out because she would want to move up into those as well. The thing is, it's not necessary. The years and years of beekeeping have shown that if you manage it well, you don't need to leave them a 3rd box. Some people overwinter with just 1 box. There's enough honey in that 1 box to keep them going. That's cutting the fine line. So the 2 boxes already is more than, it's way more than what the people overwintering them in 1 box do. So I think, it's a question of your personal preference and managing that line between what you take off and what you leave with the bees. I don't know if that answers your question. But
yeah, it does. I was just wondering about it because it seemed, seemed to be so much emphasis on feeding them. And I'm thinking, but we've taken their food and now we're feeding them. And somehow it doesn't seem to be as good as what we took for them. But it's just energy.
Sugar water, that's what nectar is. It's sugar water with a few other little components there. But what the bees really like there is that sugar water.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to ask then, and you just mentioned it, and maybe it's coming up, but so they wouldn't winter with supers on them. You'd remove the supers. Yeah. There's no benefit to.
No, at one point,
leaving.
Yeah, at one point you have such a big, huge cavity in there. It's a lot of air space in there, and the bees themselves will warm up to a certain extent. They're inside of the hive, and if it's like you in a house. If it's just you in a huge with a 20-foot ceiling, the heating, you have to heat it a lot more to feel the warmth, kind of thing. So
Okay,
there's
good.
some type of diminishing return there.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, no problem. I invite questions. So here's a picture of a general population variation over the course of a year, with the bee population maximizing during the main honey flow, and then it may drop a bit. There's a secondary honey flow, and then it drops throughout the winter and picks up again in early spring. Very typical. So is your queen dead? It's another thing you want to see while you're checking your hives. You'll look inside, you'll see no eggs, but there might be some larvae. That means, if there's no eggs, but larvae, that means the queen was there at least 3 days ago, but she seems to be not laying anymore. Where you see no eggs and no larvae, well, that means no one's been laying eggs for at least 9 days. And if you see nothing, no eggs, no larvae, no capped brood, it means no queen has been laying there for the past 21 days. It also means you haven't been monitoring your hive frequently enough. And that's bad. You shouldn't come up to your hive and find out, my God, there's no brood in there at all. That means you haven't been checking. You should check more often. If that happens, you might end up with, if you have no queen, you might end up with laying workers. The workers themselves are all females, but they're not fertilized. And they're not made for making eggs too much, but they will turn it on if they feel that there's no queen there. But it's a reaction that leads to nothing because they're not fertilized. They'll only produce drones. And also they lay like 5 or 6 eggs per cell. When you see several eggs in the cell, that's not a queen, that's a laying worker. If you only have drones, what's going to happen in your colony? Well, it's not going to go very far, right? They do nothing, the drones, and you're going to lose your colony. So what happens if you see these laying workers? Your first action is to feel bad and to vow not to let this happen again. Because once you've got them, it's very difficult to bring the hive back to normal and usually not worth the effort. It's a bit like the deformed wing virus I spoke about. Maybe if it happens in spring, okay, there's time to do something about it, but the effort is it's a very fastidious thing to do. And the chances of success, from what I understand, are not high. I've been reading about this, and based on what you have to do, I say, my conclusion was, hey, unless I really love this hive and I'm willing to abandon my family for the next 2 months as I deal with this hive, it's not worth it. So they say when you have a laying workers, you just take the hive away from the yard, shake all the bees out, and just get rid of them, basically.
Can you not just bring a new queen in and she would fix it?
It's too late by then. The bees are laying and they're not going to stop laying, and it's going to be a problem. Yeah. The whole hive has gone crazy. It's got no direction. But if your queen has died and it's your workers are not laying, you can bring in a new queen. So as I said, you have to do this before they start laying. So you can bring a new queen. It's something you could do. If you like beekeeping and you're enjoying it and you like to do meticulous work in your hives, you can become a queen you can rear queens and people will buy them from you. And it's a business. So it's about $40 for a new queen. The advantage of buying a new queen is they sell them already mated. So the queen is gone on their mating flight. They've been fertilized and they put them in a little box like this. And there's the entrance to the box you can't see there. It's this candy that plugs it, some type of paste like we talked about earlier, the fondant. And you put that in your hive. It'll take 2 or 3 days for the bees to eat through the candy. And during those 2 or 3 days, the queenless hive will get used to the scent of the new queen. And when she emerges, the chances of them accepting her are very high. Another option, if you have no queen, is to move a frame that contains eggs from another hive into your queenless hive. And the workers will then raise new queens from those eggs. That's called a split as well. I did 2 of those last summer. The disadvantage there is it'll take, we talked about it before, it takes up to a month before you get a new queen who's laying eggs again. And the eggs will take another several weeks before you get to workers. So it really sets your hive back a long time. And with our short summers, it's not ideal. You can only do this very early in the spring. There you go. It's cheap though, you save $40.
Question.
Yes, I got some raised hands here. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you mentioned about getting rid of that hive, so you take it away someplace in the field and you let all the bees go, how do you know they're not going to go back to?
Rick, that's a good question. I can't answer that with any level of confidence. I've read about it, and I don't recall exactly the procedure, but it was basically get rid of that hive because those bees are no good. They're laying eggs and they're going to give you a hard time. So if you simply search on Google, you know, what do I do with when the worker bees are laying, you know, laying workers is the term. When I have laying workers in my hive, what should you do? You'll find a lot of, you know, suggested procedures to deal with that. It's wonderful. The internet these days is fantastic. Make sure your answers are from reliable sources though. But it doesn't happen that often. I've never had it happen to me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and there was someone else with their hand up? Are we good? Very good. So what are the internal signs of impending swarms? That's what you're going to face with every beekeeper, like laying workers and deformed wing virus. And, you know, if you won't have that problem if you're just doing the basic following up on your hives and monitoring. It's not something you'll have to face. But swarms is almost definitely you'll have to face. You'll have to deal with it. We talked about swarms. When the swarms happen, you lose at least 50% of your worker bees, if not more, and leaving you with a very weakened hive. So a beekeeper will often, part of his or her management strategies is to discourage swarms. So to discourage them, you also want to see if they're happening and do something about that. So what are the signs that you might be getting a swarm? Well, you know, the bees start bearding, as we mentioned earlier. And then you'll want to look inside and you might spot some queen cells like this. They're very distinctive and they're quite easy to find. They may be hard to see if your frames are just covered with bees, then you can't really see what's going on. But in that case, you use your smoker and smoke a bit, the bees will move around and you'll get a chance to spot any particular queen cells. I'm having a problem with my dance here. So yeah, you'll have bearding, and you'll probably, the chances are you may not see any eggs because by the time these queens are ready to merge, the other queen has stopped laying eggs. The workers will stop feeding her. She'll lose a bit of weight, so she's better at flying. Those are all signs that you might have a swarm, and then you see queen cells. So what to do? Well, first of all, you want to not get there, right? So you want to reduce incentives for swarming. You want to ensure conditions are not crowded, so you provide some extra space as the population grows. They can move up into the honey supers. The bees, it's their natural thing to want to swarm, and they're usually living in cavities and trees and whatnot with limited space. So that when their populations are growing and they sense that there's no more room, that's a trigger for swarming. But if they sense that there's always more room, they'll have less of a tendency to swarm. Doesn't mean they won't swarm, but you know, let's say they have an 80% chance of swarming. No, you've just reduced it to 65%, for instance. You can make a split. This is a good way to expand your bee yard, your colonies. You make a split by you basically create your own nuke. You take 4 or 5 frames of bees with brood and eggs. You take them out of your hive that has a strong population, and you put them in a new hive. Now the hive that's just lost those 5 frames will think, oh my God, you know, our population went down. This is not a good time to swarm. So again, we'll reduce their tendency to want to swarm. You can do this twice. Who knows, even more on a strong hive. One strong hive can produce 2, maybe even 3 new hives for you in the same season. So, you know, if you want to expand, that's one way of doing it. You may want also to seek out and destroy queen cells at least once a week during the swarming season, and the May to early September. That's a lot of work, you know, to find the queen cells. You've got 2 brood boxes, and maybe you have a box of honey on top that's getting heavy. So you have to remove the box on top. Then you have to look to each of the 10 frames on your top brood box, look for queen cells. Now, the queen cells, the frames on the edge, the last 2 frames on either side rarely have brood, but it happens. So you have to look at basically all 10 frames and do the same with the brood box below. And then you have to put it all back. You can understand that your bees don't really like it when you're poking around inside the innards of their brood box like that. So that you can start getting angry bees, and it becomes a lot of work. And this is one of the reasons why some people prefer having only 1 brood box. It becomes a lot easier. You're just going through 10 frames and that's it. You're not going through 20 frames. you're doing this dressed up in a bee suit, could be 30 degrees out. It's a lot of work. You start wondering, why did I get into beekeeping? This is a lot of work. And that's probably the limiting factor for me, at least, in not expanding too much. I don't want to have 20 hives, or I think it does become a lot of work. Right now I'm at 7. That's my absolute maximum. So when you're destroying the queen cells, you also have to be sure that it is because they're about to swarm. It's not because they have lost their queen for natural reasons and they're just replacing her. So something to keep in mind. And yeah. So we'll move on to parasites and diseases. Time is running fast here. I'll try to move quickly here. The varroa mite I mentioned was a very common. You're about 100% guaranteed to have bees with varroa mite. You can't escape it anymore. They're very small, the size of a pinhead. They look like a crab, a little crab with little legs. They're reddish. And you can see them on a bee pretty easily if you happen to catch a bee that has one on it. And they'll tend to go move around in the bee. They'll slide in between their various little layers here on their abdomen and suck on their blood. You know, a bee can handle a varroa mite. It's just, it's like you have mosquitoes around your head. It's not much fun and it gets you all frustrated, but it may not kill you. But if you have too many of that, and then it's a cold winter, perhaps the queen has died for disease, and all these little factors gather together and they could kill your hive. And the varroa mite is one of those factors. It's a more important one. And so it's something you want to keep under control. They didn't exist in Canada until about the mid-1990s. When I first started beekeeping, it was not an issue. So now it is. So I learned how to treat. It's not such a big deal. External parasite, very common. Check. These are the ones that are responsible for the deformed wing virus if you have too many. I got some raised hands here. Go ahead.
So you said before they weren't in Canada. So where did they come from?
They were. That's a good question. Hey, they were. I think they were. I don't think they're originally a parasite associated with honeybees, but they somehow made the leap to honeybees. It could have been in Europe or Africa, and we import bees from those places, and they come with varroa mites before we knew what was going on. They were in the United States, and because people often migrate their honeybees to different parts of the country to pollinate crops. Then they brought some honeybees from Texas, they bring them up to the Canadian border, and then the bees, they swarm, they might swarm across the border with their mites, and eventually they become part of the honeybee ecosystem. Does that answer your question, Massimo?
Yeah, it does.
So the varroa mite, yeah, that's something you have to deal with. The varroa mite lives in a hive. It lives on the bee. It reproduces in the pupa stage with the bee as it goes through metamorphosis. So you might go in with one female and you come out with several. In fact, a new emerging bee, and they spread that way. And as a beekeeper, you want to get an idea of how infested your bees are with mites. There's different ways of doing that. I'm not going to get into all the details on exactly how to do this because that's a whole new lesson. Just suffice it to say, there's a lot of excellent stuff on the internet. You go on a YouTube video of how to do an alcohol wash, how to do an icing sugar shake for varroa, and you'll have some keen person who's going to have filmed all that and show you exactly how to do it. You basically take a cup of bees and you mix them with alcohol. It kills the bees. Shake it around, and you pour it all through a type of colander, and then the mites will flow through, and you can count the mites. The number of bees you have by cup of bees. But the number of mites you have by cup of bees gives you an indication of how badly infested they are. You can do something similar with icing sugar, and that doesn't kill the bees, and it certainly must make them wonder what's going on. And you can also use something called a sticky board. I'm putting the word here because you can do further research. A sticky board is something you put under your hive. You have a screen bottom because mites will also naturally die over time. So if you put a white sticky board under your screen bottom, and the mites die, they'll fall on that. So you can count how many mites per day are falling on that, are stuck on that board. It gives you an idea how infested your hive is. And depending on the level of infestation, you may or may not want to treat them. How do you treat for varroa mite? There's many different ways and products. I use these two. Really, that's what I do on a routine basis. Oxalic acid and Formic Pro, which is formic acid. These are two organic acids. They're considered organic treatments by the organic certification people. Formic Pro comes as an absorbent pad full of the acid. You just put it inside your hive and it releases fumes. It bothers the bees, but it doesn't kill them, whereas it kills the varroa. Oxalic acid is something you drip with you mix it in with water and you drip it in your hives in the fall. Very easy to apply. The same kind of thing. It kills the varroa. Apivar is another product. That's a manufactured product. It's not an organic acid. That's another product that we use. There's a lot of work underway to try to develop hygienic behavior in bees. We talked about different strains of bees expressing different behavior patterns. Are they more aggressive? Do they swarm more or less? Do they collect more honey? One of the things that we look for is whether they're hygienic or not. And the hygienic bees are the ones that will detect varroa and remove it naturally, among other things. They'll keep their hives clean. So there's work being done there. So this is still very much a work in progress, how to deal with varroa. Don't be afraid of this though. I mean, it's once you figure out how to use it, look at again, go on YouTube and you say, oh, that's it, I can do that, and you do it. Now, these other diseases I'm going to mention I've never run into them personally, and they're out there, but maybe 1% of hives will report this, and you have to keep an eye out for them. The more serious one is American fall brood. It's very contagious. It will kill your colonies. The sign of American fall brood is your larvae. They die, they rot, it smells bad, and you put a stick in there and it's all stringy. And look at this, the cap brood, they're all dead inside, and there's a little oily type of discolored appearance there. That's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. So if you have American fall brood, again, it's reported in only 1.2% of colonies inspected in Ontario in 2017. Now, not all colonies are inspected, only the colonies that are being sold or the owner thinks there's something wrong, calls the inspector, those colonies are inspected. So probably 1.2% is quite a bit more than the actual natural occurrence of this disease. So it's not something you should have to worry about too much, but keep an eye out for that. It's a bacteria, highly contagious. It will contaminate your equipment. So even if you've killed it, your equipment still has the spores. If you start it the following year, you might have it again. So there's no cure. You can only try to prevent infection, avoid secondhand equipment. Catching swarms is a risk, and monitor and move quickly if you detect this. This is what you do. There you go. That's what you do. Okay.
Yeah.
Like bleach won't kill them or anything. You basically throw all your hives away.
Yeah, because they're all contaminated with the spore. It's like a mushroom spores. They're all over the place, and you can't really deal with that. And you don't want, if you're in a place where there's other beekeepers in your neighborhood, the bees are going to mix and they're all going to start getting it, and it's not a good thing. So there's other diseases, wax moth. That's more of a bother than a serious problem. It's the moth will lay eggs in the hive, and then the larvae will eat the comb and the honey, and they're going to leave a mess in there. It's a mess. You'll have moths in your honey. So I've never had this problem. But keep your comb away from the in enclosed places so the moths can't get to them, especially after you've extracted your honey. Don't just leave them around. The moths will find this and lay eggs there. I've never had this problem though. Sac brood virus. I'm throwing these names at you. If you want to do more research, it's all there. It's again another rare disease, and usually colonies can take care of it by themselves. European fall brood, not as bad as American fall brood. That can be handled. You don't have to report those. The only ones you need to report are the American fall brood and the small hive beetle. This picture here is of the small hive beetle. That's a new arrival. We don't have it yet in Eastern Ontario, but in 5 years, we're going to have it because it's on its way, okay? a bit like the wax moth. It's not going to kill your hive, but it's a pain. You don't want to have them there. They're going to mess things up, make it harder for you to extract your honey. I see that it's 6 o'clock. I mentioned other diseases here, chalk brood, but these are like having a cold. Your bees will have a cold, but they usually get over it if they're healthy. Just keep your bees healthy. And here's a small hive beetle. We'll have to learn how to deal with that. We haven't had it yet, but it's coming. It's already present in Southern Ontario. Okay, that was my last slide. I rushed it a little bit here. I'm sorry, it was a full class. I've got you some videos. I hope you're taking the chance to watch 1 or 2. They're all very good. There's one here, treating Varroa with formic acid. I don't have any stakes in this company, but it shows you how to do it. So you get an idea of how complicated it is. And there you go. I think I'll stop it at that. Oh, sorry, there's one other video here. What's this? How to identify and report suspected pesticide poisoning incidents. So there you go, if you want to look into that. And finally, our final slide is announcing, whoops,
Thursday.
wrong date there. That's the wrong date. I'm not going to hide that. I'm going to hide that one.
January 14th.
Yeah. I'll send you the right note. So that's the end of today's lesson, and I hope it was okay, a bit rushed, but we can start with questions now if anyone has them, or I'm happy to receive questions by email or later in the week at another time.